Welcome back to Van Ventures with Jodie with Isla and Eden and Saxon.
This video covers most of the work that we've done on the walls in the van, and you'll see that there's other things happening in between in this because it covers kind of like a 2-month period where we're building various things kind of all at once, but I decided to document the videos element by element. It's just easier to sort of show how we've done that way. The first thing to go into the walls is insulation, same as the floor, but we're using 50mm this time because the space that we're filling to meet from the back of the wall to the front of the strut is closer to 50mm. Probably a little bit more than that, but once you add the curvature into the van, 50 kind of covers most of it, and you can fill in the rest of the holes with the recycled bottle insulation, which we've also stuffed into all the little nooks and crannies. I've cut this out to go around the rear arch, including this awkward little channel up the back with the saw, and this was my first cut. No messing around. After that, look at that. We also started to run some of the wire and conduit through the beams, ready for things like lights and USB sockets and various electrical things to go in place later. This didn't go entirely to plan. Some of the beams have holes that are so small we couldn't get a piece of conduit through without drilling out a bigger hole, which I didn't want to do. I managed to get some of the wiring done this way, but some of it will have to come later, and I found ways to kind of work around with that. Any parts of metal, in particular these beams that stick out further than the others, anything that I knew wasn't going to be clad with wood purely because it was just too awkward a shape or too protruded to get a batten on it, I put carpet onto, knowing that if it's visible later it will look much nicer than just raw metal. We also made some holes in some of the beams to put riv nuts in. These two up here are for my hammock chair. This is the first riv nut I've ever put in, so don't judge me too harshly on this one, please. Got this riv nut here, and then I'm going to squeeze that into this hole, and it's going to suck the back into the metal and then create what we call like a seal, riv nut, and then I can put my hammock in there. And then we put more riv nuts into the beam along the back of the van, ready for the bed supports to go into. We wanted to make these as strong as possible for the bed, so there's actually a metal washer behind the riv nut, which is then encased in that clamp as well. Unfortunately, we could not find a washer with a hole size that was the right size. They were either too big or too small. So we bought an 11mm drill bit and drilled a slightly larger hole out of the centre of those washers. We wanted to frame the windows really nicely, so we made a curved template to figure out what goes around the edges, and whilst Dad's cutting that out a piece of ply, Mum has started on all of the sanding and the priming and the painting, of which there is a lot for the walls, so she's been my resident painter. And then these little pieces of ply tucked round that bend, and they kind of sit into a groove, and that creates just a backdrop to cover the corners. And then we made a main frame to go around the edge out of an 18mm thick pine board, which sits really snugly around the window, and then we built all of the battens for the walls around that frame and then outwards where they wanted to be, ready for the cladding to go onto. So whilst Dad and I are screwing in the battens, my favourite sanding assistant is outside perfecting these beams, staining the window frames this lovely Jacobean oak, and then varnishing them with Osmo oil so they're lovely and shiny. Next, we put up the battens for the top of the van. This was a bit more fiddly because you're trying to work around a curve that you know you're going to have to add cladding onto later, but we managed to, with a combination of no more nails and screws, have attached things at the right angle so that it joins up to the ceiling really nicely. We also made this little monitoring station using the leftovers from the window frames. And this kind of only exists because the shape of the van is so awkward in that corner when you just come out of the doorway. It really juts out. We knew we'd never get any kind of cladding on front of it, and I thought this would work quite well. So we basically built this little box up here that I can access all my little electrical points later on. And then on the other side of the van, we've added these higher up beams which are drilled straight into the metalwork. This will be part of the support for the overhead cabinets later. And now everything has been sanded and painted and stained, we can start screwing and gluing and bolting it all into place. The great thing about these window pieces is that because it sits in this groove, it kind of creates this wedge in between the window and the metalwork of the van, which meant if someone were to try and break into the van by removing the window from the outside by any means, they'd have a real job, because this is then glued to the inside of that as well, creating like a sandwich.
In the groove.
In the groove. Just like Madonna. Once the windows were put in, they just looked so nice. Really, really nice finish with the stain and the Osmo. So now with all of the battening in place, we could start adding the cladding. I'm just using tongue and groove for this, and we started off by putting Osmo oil on the backs of them for some kind of water protection in case there is any moisture get into the backs of them. But we later switched to PVA glue, watered down a little bit, just because it's so much cheaper and pretty much will do the same job if we're just looking to waterproof them and not worried about the actual look of the finish. It's just going on the back. It turned out to be really quite fiddly, putting the tongue and groove in around the windows, around the awkward edges, around the monitoring station. Just every single piece had to be cut precision, and it is really quite hard. For the end here by the door, we kind of cut this like a curve just to give it some kind of feature as it snakes up around that edge. Now this wall is almost done. Mum's given it a few coats of paint in a lovely Valspar shade called You're Blushing, which is not quite white, it's ever so slightly pink, and you can just see the difference between the white and the baseboard underneath. What I haven't mentioned, but you probably already noticed, is the vapor barrier that's behind the cladding in front of the insulation. We couldn't really do this all in one go, we had to just add it piece by piece as we cladded the different areas of the van. Just like we did for the floor, we used the foil tape to stick this down, and for the bottom half of the walls we've reused the ply that came in the van originally, just cut it down to the right height that we wanted, and then painted and screwed that back on top. This will pretty much all be covered with furniture anyway, so it doesn't need to look nice, it just needs to be a cover. And since some of these screws were really low down, I tried to rope in some help from some of the shorter members of the family.
And they've got 5 kids.
Yeah.
And they travel from around America.
We also used the original wheel arch boxes that came with the van. Dad took them apart, put them back together with extra pieces so that the lid actually sits in top and can be removed. This should make it easier to run cables through if we need to. I covered them in carpet and then they were ready to go back in. Dad can't wait to get this in. He's been waiting 2 weeks for me to carpet it. And I can push it in its little place. How's that? Happy? Yeah?
It's so much better than the horrible wood.
We've made a little ply to go in this awkward little groove along the edge here. Here it is.
Whack, whack.
And it fits in there. Just like that. Need to trim that a little bit off the end, but then it will fit perfectly. And then I'll go have a little ducky in the corner. Alright, ducky. To finish off all of the raw edges and joins, we used these different moulding pieces which Mum painted as well. And we used these to bridge the little gap left between the wall and the ceiling. You'll see the ceiling done in another video later. And then because everything is curved in this van, we then use some flexible filler just to fill in those final little gaps. And Mum taking it a little bit too far with the neatness of this, but that is what she does best. The very last section of the wall was this really awkward bit above the door. We probably spent way more time on this than we could afford, but it does look really nice now. And you can see my hammock hooks are now in place. To complete this wall, I've added a USB point and a 12-volt cigarette charging point for a couple of items that are going to live on a shelf along here. And then we added one final trim to the window frame just to make those edges look really nice and neat. And I can't complete this video without showing you the hammock chair. This was actually the very first thing that I ordered for the van after buying the van itself. I'd seen someone else with one and I just wanted it so badly, and I knew that because it would have to go into the structure of the van, I'd have to plan for it early on. So finally this is paying off and I get to test it out for the first time, tentatively. It should work fine because it's all using riv nuts in the metalwork and then climbing equipment, so it's highly rated for much more weight than I'm ever going to put on it. But there's still that little part of your mind that goes, is this okay? And yeah, it's okay. I just look forward to using it with a better view than the current one. And just when you think it's all done, we have a whole other wall to do. This one went much faster and it's again partially obscured by furniture, so you can see some of the kitchen is now in place. There's a backboard ready for the backsplash to go on, so there's not much cladding to go around because you get so far up the wall. And then there's overhead cabinets, which will also come in another video soon. As you can see, we're really getting into our stride now on this van build. There is a long way to go, but we've got a lot done, and there's always time for a cup of tea and a little bit of silliness.
We're on a road to nowhere. Oop, oop, oop.